Hello there. Thanks very much for joining me on this series of webinars on future strategies for Ovine Johnes disease. The objective of this series is to equip sheep producers in Queensland to manage Johnes disease risks into the future as the national and Queensland frameworks and strategies for managing Johnes disease change. There are new tools and new responsibilities and options for producers to manage Johnes disease, and I hope this information is useful to producers. This is the third of 3 parts to the series. The first part just provided an introductory background to Ovine Johnes disease in Queensland and nationally. The second part described the changing frameworks of the national programs and new legislation in Queensland. And this part is going to describe the new strategy for Queensland, both at farm and regional levels. I intend to talk about the objectives of the new strategies, clarify what new responsibilities exist under the new program, describe how producers can manage Johnes disease risk for sheep into the future, both on farm and as groups. The new strategy for Queensland is based around new national programs and new legislation. The Queensland Government established a JD review committee comprising industry leaders to consider what that might look like to best meet the needs of the Queensland industries into the future. That review committee came up with a vision for how we want Johnes disease to look like in Queensland into the future. We know there's a low prevalence of Johnes disease in Queensland. We want to maintain that low prevalence into the future, but we want industry to manage that maintenance of low prevalence with minimal regulatory impost. We found through recent incident responses that the regulatory response to Johnes disease carries a very high burden for producers that are affected by it, and we believe that industry can manage this disease without the burden that regulation imposes. I described in part 2 the general biosecurity obligation under the new legislation. That general biosecurity obligation for Johnes disease confers upon all sheep producers in Queensland a responsibility to assess and manage Johnes disease risks and to prevent spread of disease, whether that be negligently or deliberately. The only part of Johnes disease management into the future in Queensland which will be regulated will be that Johnes disease remains notifiable. The purpose of notifiability of Johnes disease is in order to credibly certify herds and flocks for export. The future management of Johnes disease relies on producers taking responsibility for assessing risk and managing risk. In the absence of specific regulations, there will no longer be a requirement for health certificates for bringing sheep into Queensland. There will no longer be quarantines imposed on properties where Johnes disease is suspected or confirmed to occur. However, that does not mean that producers can get away with turning a blind eye to responsibility for Johnes disease. That responsibility clearly exists as a general biosecurity obligation to assess and manage risk. It's important that producers continue to meet their biosecurity obligations. They need to maintain their boundary biosecurity and be careful of what animals come onto their properties. In particular, you need to understand that there will no longer be quarantines of properties in Queensland or indeed interstate, and that movements from at-risk properties can occur if you want to protect your property and your flock from Johnes disease, you will need to be sure that animals moving onto your property are low risk of Johnes disease. A critical part of that is ensuring that every time you bring an animal onto your property, it comes with a sheep health statement, and that you assess the information on the sheep health statement to make sure that the risk entailed in that movement doesn't put you at risk of getting Johnes disease onto your property. There's further details about what should be on a sheep health statement on our website from the 1st of July. Basically, the standards of entry for Johnes disease for sheep coming onto your property should not change from what they are now going forward, but it's your responsibility now, rather than government's responsibility, to make sure that that standard is met. But there's other things that you can do to maintain your biosecurity as well. Monitor your sheep health. If there is an apparent problem in sheep health, have it investigated, preferably by a veterinarian. At least under the new non-regulated model, you will know that if Johnes disease is detected, there will be support provided by government, but no longer quarantines and movement restrictions imposed. There will still be an obligation under the general biosecurity obligation for you to contain any risk of disease, and certainly one of the response mechanisms to Johnes disease into the future will be use of vaccination to mitigate disease in the face of infection. At this point in time, I wouldn't be recommending vaccination be taken up by properties which are not infected. It's a reasonably costly exercise, and there's minimal risk of Johnes disease on almost all Queensland properties right now. You can also get greater assurance against spread of disease, of Johnes disease, by insisting on assurance testing, preferably through enrolment in SheepMap, that's the Market Assurance Program, which operates nationally and confers monitored -1 or MN1 or MN2 or MN3 status for low-risk herds. And I would encourage people who are bringing sheep onto their property, but particularly if you're bringing sheep onto your property from high-risk areas of Australia, being the central and southern highlands of New South Wales and all of Victoria and all of Tasmania, where the disease is in much greater prevalence than it is in Queensland, to seek market assurance MN status for sheep coming onto your property. What we do know about Johnes disease is that it spreads, when it becomes established, it spreads fairly readily from property to property through the straying of sheep, presumably. So Johnes disease is best tackled on a regional level as well as an individual property level. We've found that interstate, in where disease has established, particularly in Tasmania and Kangaroo Island in South Australia, is that a regional approach can really pay dividends in driving down prevalence, and in northern New South Wales and western New South Wales and northwestern Victoria, and through a regulator approach in South Australia and Queensland as well, that a group approach can protect low-risk areas from introduction of disease. So I would encourage the sheep industry in Queensland to consider implementing a regional approach, whether that be through a whole-of-state approach or a local approach. There will need to be industry leadership in that sort of approach. Government support is certainly available to provide technical, logistical and policy advice in running a regional biosecurity plan, but government will not be providing a regulatory support for a regional biosecurity plan in Queensland into the future. There's a template plan available which identifies appropriate standards for managing the risk of Johnes disease through entry or spread of disease, response to infection if it's detected, and what sort of resources are available. Certainly we've found since 2013, when the regional biosecurity plans have been implemented, that there are particular benefits through preventing lateral spread, through peer support, through responding to infection, and through getting trade access to like areas. So I would certainly encourage the Queensland industry to look at developing regional biosecurity plans into the future. There's a map there of the current regional biosecurity plan areas in Australia and particularly in New South Wales, and that chart on the bottom right shows how a regional approach was appropriate to the New South Wales low risk areas. It was less appropriate to areas where there's a much higher prevalence of disease in Victoria, as shown in the left bottom chart there. I would expect that an effective regional biosecurity plan would continue to maintain low prevalence in this sort of pattern. Certainly the voluntary New South Wales regional biosecurity plan areas have reported very high ownership and compliance since 2013, when those programs were established. So the key points about Johnes disease that I hope that you can take out of this series are that Johnes disease is very slow to shift and slow to develop, but once it's established, its spread and impacts are inexorable. Johnes disease risk management into the future is going to be up to you as producers. You're not going to be able to rely on government to protect Queensland into the future, but Queensland Government can provide support to develop and implement tools for farms and groups into the future. In order to effectively manage risk, you'll need to skill up. It's not that hard, there's plenty of information available, but key to going forward into the future, if you want to protect your property from Johnes disease, you need to make deliberate decisions about what animals are coming onto your property and what sort of risk you're prepared to accept and how you manage that risk. As I say, this is not too hard. Basically, it's about doing what you've always done, but recognising that the frameworks around what you've always done are now changing, and you will need to make some deliberate decisions rather than rely on others to have protected you as in the past, particularly around the standards of entry of sheep onto your property. And in particular, I would encourage the formation of groups in Queensland or a whole of Queensland group in order to manage this risk collectively. Further information available about the changing frameworks and how to manage into the future are available at these websites. Thanks very much for listening to this.